Promotion and Tenure Boot Camp. Carrie Fishner, April Davies, and Dan Harms will be presenting for the next 90 minutes or so. So Carrie Fishner is the director of the Resnick Library at SUNY Delhi, and she is the liaison for the culinary, business, and hospitality departments, as well as the leisure collection. Carrie is also past president of SUNYLA and serves on the board for the SLC. April Davies is the head of Technical and Public Services at SUNY Kobelskill's Van Wagenen Library, where she's liaison for early childhood, psychology, math, and natural sciences. April chaired her campus's Promotion and Tenure Committee for several years, has served as an outside reviewer for several SUNY campuses, and is a past president of SUNYLA. And Dan Harms is the Instructional Services Librarian at SUNY Cortland. So we're all really excited about this pre-conference. We have a lot of people attending, so we would encourage you, if you have a question, just to submit it in the chat box, and then the presenters will respond as they have time, or there'll be periods throughout the next 90 minutes where we can pause and respond to those questions. And then at about 2:20 or so, I'll just give a 10-minute warning to make sure that we wrap up on time. Okay, thank you.
Just a note that we are recording this session, so I did start the recording as Elena started introducing the session. So we are recording this for the conference archive.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started. I have the first section, which is going to be finding policies and guidelines. One thing that's come up and became very clear both through our histories in SUNY and in our efforts to look through different policies and guidelines and procedures is that they're all kind of all over the place. We're speaking from our own experience here. I can say that, for example, community colleges are just, so I can't talk about the differences between our process and the community college process because the community colleges are so different from each other. So what we want to start out with is how you basically get this information about your particular campus to start out with. So the first principle is to ask. Always ask. It's always better to ask about these questions before they start becoming important to your life. Knowing what you're getting yourself into, and if there's any potential hiccups, is always better to know about that before you're sitting there in front of a committee and you're trying to show them what you're doing, and then they have some questions or say you didn't come up with something you needed. So ask preemptively. I know that's sometimes difficult for new librarians to do who are feeling uncertain about how exactly they fit in, but I think the important thing is to be polite and not be afraid. If there are other tenure track librarians at your institution, join forces with them. Get together and then figure out what you need to know, and then go out and start asking those questions. I'd say ask a few questions at a time because there may be many of them, and you may think of some as you go along. So just let the people know you are going to be asking more questions as you go through, and just give them a few at a time to think about. And when someone says that they don't know the answer, which will happen, ask who could be a good source? Where should we go to get an answer to this? And hopefully what that will do is it'll also put you in touch with other people on campus who can be great sources for you, maybe not only in the tenure process, but also going beyond that. So this is where you want to start. So what do you want to be? What kind of information do you need? Things that are good to know. First of all, who is part of that review process you'll be going through? Is it your fellow librarians, the director, faculty from outside sometimes, administrators? Who are you speaking to? And this will become important later on as you start to sort of craft whatever materials you're putting together toward that audience. So when we're talking about that material, what material are they going to use? Is it a file someplace? Is it a portfolio? Are there teaching evaluations that are incorporated in? Do they get comments from people? And who can add to and view that material? I think we don't want to have our career decisions made in some secret file that's off someplace and nobody knows anything about it, and we can't see it. So figuring out what you can do to add to and view whatever it is beforehand can be helpful. Knowing the timelines, you know, when will you be, what are the dates for the appointments? How long are you appointed? When will somebody, what do people usually get tenure? When can you be promoted? When are you going to get notifications for all these? Keeping an eye out for those is always good. Appeals. Knowing the appeals process before you have to use it, I'd say, is quite important. There's a grievance policy that was required by middle states accreditors and the UUP contract. This may, of course, if you're not middle states accredited or under UUP, this can vary, but knowing where that process is and how to start it can be, I think, is crucial. And finally, who should I speak to in case of a delay or a problem? Because one thing that I think we've learned is that there's a good potential for at least a delay at some point, because someone's supposed to be evaluating the documentation, they get backed up or something like that, and knowing what to do in that circumstance can be important. So when you're looking specifically for documents which give you the insight into these things, what are you looking for? Well, it can vary quite a bit. It could be the collective bargaining agreement, the contract between your union and the campus or the state. It can be the SUNY Board of Trustees or other system policies, policies for your college as a whole, policies for the library or your unit, and unwritten norms, which you often find out by showing these documents to someone and asking about, hey, how do we interpret this? Or hopefully not, we haven't been doing that for years and we probably need to, which does happen. Because the people get into the groove with their practice, and sometimes they look back at the original documents and are like, oh wait, that isn't necessarily what we're supposed to be doing here. In a lot of cases, these documents are online. I wish I could say that was the case all the time. Often it's not. So you may have to ask a good number of people about where to find these, but I think that that's always it's always good to have them all in hand. If you are somebody here who's maybe tenured already or has some sort of committee responsibility, one good thing to do would be to make these available to incoming librarians as soon as they're hired. Just say, okay, you don't need to look at this right now, but make sure you've got this packet of material that you're going to get back to if you have questions. So that is one thing that you can do if you have a little bit more authority at your institution, that you can do to make sure that people have the information they need. And the information can vary quite a bit. I have seen at least one community college agreement, collective bargaining agreement, that got really into details. This is not necessarily the case with others. The example I'm going to use here is the UUP contract and SUNY Board of Trustees policies. One, because if you are in a UUP represented campus, this is what's going to probably be the governing documents. And if you're not, it'll at least give you some idea of the sort of things you want to look at or the questions you want to ask. So we'll go ahead and get a little bit into these. This is going to be a very surface level sort of examination. Article 30 of the contract says you should be evaluated through the process in the Board of Trustees policies. And that the employee should receive an appointment letter with certain information in it. So knowing that you're appointed, how long you're appointed, and that sort of thing. And always definitely read your appointment letter when you get it. The next article is about personnel files, that they are kept by the college and that employees have the right to review them. After someone's employed 3 years, if they receive an evaluation, they have a right to speak to the person who wrote that evaluation. And get some feedback on that. Also, if an academic committee creates a file while reviewing someone's documentation, the employee should also have a right to review what's in that file. So a certain due process provisions there to make sure that if people can't just compile files of questionable stuff about you and then take a look at those. That's what the purpose of those are. Article 32, you should receive notice of non-renewal prior to the date of non-renewal, and these are usually after a certain point for a period of months or I think up to a year. I would have to go and pull out the contract itself to look at specifics, and I would encourage you to do so if this applies to you. Also, just as a quick note, it says that if you are leaving the SUNY system, you should give notice to the campus 30 days in advance. This is, if you find yourself in a position where you can't do it, I'll just add, you probably want to talk to somebody about it to make sure there's no financial repercussions or anything like that. But it is contractual that you should give 30 days notice. And Article 33 is quite lengthy. It's about the right to receive reasons for a decision and appeal after the president makes a decision. And so that is sort of that, once again, giving people, opening up that appeals process and letting people what they need to do. Now, what you'll notice about all of these is it doesn't say a whole lot of what's going on with the evaluations themselves, aside from, due process stuff. That we get more into in the SUNY Board of Trustees policies. So first of all, one important thing to know is that SUNY does not have tenure. It has continuing appointment. So the first question is, what is the difference there? And I think, having looked into this, my answer is, who knows? I wish I could not come up with anything. This is a status that is granted by the chancellor, not the local campus. It can be granted at any time. It can be granted on initial hire, which is a little interesting, but it usually isn't. Usually it is after 7 years. For UUP employees, the decision usually ends up being by the end of the 6th year. And it is possible to have service credits transferred from other SUNY campuses or other previous jobs up to 3 years toward that 7-year mark. Now, I will say, so this is something, if you're transferring between campuses, you want to ask about. And you also want to get a sense of the policies and procedures at the new campus, because sometimes they're different enough that you may want to say, hey, I don't want to have any of this time transferred in. It's okay. But sometimes that can give you sort of give you some previous credit that will help you along if you are already well along your way to continuing appointment under the new, at the new job. Before continuing appointment.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Hey, Dan, can I chime in just for a second here?
Yeah, sure.
That the credit thing can also get you hired at a higher rank, which of course means more money. So don't forget about that.
Okay, thank you. That's good to know. So before continuing appointment, we have two sorts of appointments, temporary and term appointments. Temporary is usually part-time or replacement up to 1 year. It's visiting. It does not count towards continuing appointment, just to be clear about that. And then you get term appointments. These are what most tenure track people, well, probably all tenure track people will be under. They're up to 3 years in length, but they can be 1 year, they can be 2 years. I think people from Cortland know that sometimes you can have some weird fraction in there, like 2.5 years, just because there was a point, for example, where they wanted to get us all on the same calendar with the teaching faculty. And so they gave out some very, unusual appointments. They do have the option of this at your campus. So knowing what the norm is important. I think one thing we found out, I believe at one point, if memory serves, Cortland people can correct me if I'm wrong, is that we were going through on 1-year appointments for librarians, but everybody else was sort of had moved to 2-year appointments for a lot of teaching faculty. And we said, well, maybe that's something we should be doing as well. So knowing the norm, asking about it, and maybe even saying, say if you have to negotiate something, saying, hey, usually I get a 1-year appointment. Maybe I can get a 2-year appointment instead for a little bit more job security. That is something you might be able to do. But once again, none of the decision for continuing appointment has to be made at that end of that 6th year. What about the evaluations themselves? Well, colleges should evaluate people. We've established this. This is important. And then we get some sample evaluation criteria. Note that the college may consider, but shall not be limited to consideration of these 5 criteria I'm about to outline. This is important for you because shall not be limited to consideration of does a lot of heavy lifting for librarians. As we'll see as we go through them. So the first one is mastery of subject matter, which is advanced degrees, honors, and awards. effectiveness in teaching, colleagues' judgment, teaching materials, and student feedback. Scholarly ability, research work and publications, art, reputation. Effectiveness of university service, such as service to college or service to community, and continuing growth, which is keeping up with the field and increased responsibility. Now, some of these are kind of vague, of course. I mean, continuing growth seems to sort of bleed into other areas. And I think we've also found at Cortland that mastery of subject matter and continuing growth kind of bleed into each other a lot. There's not really a clear, there's not a clear category for some things we do regularly, like reference service or technical services. Maybe, you know, supervisory duties fall under continuing growth and that increased responsibility. But there's often a need to basically, you know, think about what exactly we're doing and how it fits into these categories, knowing at the same time that with some communication with the campus, we can sometimes say, well, you know, it says you don't have to limit it to this. And so maybe we can open up a few extra categories. Cortland has 2 extra categories to deal with this sort of thing. So that's just an example once again, and that's the sort of thing you can look for as you're going, you know, you're going through these various documents. So once you've got these, you're going to probably find that this system was really set up for teaching faculty, not librarians. So there's probably a need to ask some questions beyond, you know, what's in them. For example, what publications are expected? Do they expect you to write a book? They want to see peer-reviewed articles. Are choice reviews okay? Some colleges may want you to do nothing. And knowing that up front can be a major load off. Knowing what organizations are valuable to join. A lot of people join ACRL? Do they join NYLA? Are people going to these, you know, are people expected to go to, you know, the annual summer meetings or the midwinter meetings? You should always join SUNYLA, of course, because SUNYLA is a great bargain and a wonderful organization. But, you know, knowing that is often great in terms of sort of seeing where the professional networks are and what they expect to see in terms of your CV. Now, the most important thing to ask as you're going forward is, how does whatever your new duties you take on or projects you take on fulfill the requirements for tenure and promotion? Now, you are an employee at an organization. If your boss says to do something, you should do it. But it's always good to ask up front, okay, so how does this fit into my, you know, my plan for reaching these goals? Because sometimes if it's not entirely clear, it's something you want to talk about up front, so you can talk about what kind of documentation might need to be created, or whether you need a little bit to have, you know, to move things around a bit in terms of your duties for a short term to be able to get done what you need to get done. But I would encourage everybody to always ask that question. You know, sometimes, you know, you're in your boss's office and they suggest you do something new. And it's not clear how it fits in, just ask. And hopefully that will help you move along and not get stuck on some sort of, you know, path where you're like, oh, well, gee, you get into this great project. It's sometimes something you're really enthusiastic about. And then you realize, oh, wait, I'm not sure where this goes in my documentation. So always ask about that beforehand. And I think people will generally be happy to accommodate you and try to find a way to make that work. All right, so that brings me to the end of this section, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to see if we have any questions in the chat.
No questions yet.
Okay.
All right. I just want to make a note that we do have several other librarians who have, aside from April, Dan, and myself, who have volunteered to offer themselves up as additional, I'm going to say mentors, although it's not a formal program. So they may chime in as well during the question and answer portions of today's session. So if you hear their voices or see them pop up, don't be surprised. And I'll go ahead and share my screen now and jump into the next session. Okay, Can you all see the screen? I think so. Okay, good. So we're gonna move right along. So we've talked a little bit about understanding how you find your policy and your guidelines and what you need to be looking for. And so now we'll talk a little bit about the documentation that you should be holding on to and keeping track of. So what types of documentation are we talking about? One of those is your personnel file. And Dan talked a little bit about that with Article 31, which is in the UUP contract. So for those of you who aren't UUP, it doesn't necessarily cover that. But what's in your personnel file? Well, it would contain anything that would have any commendations, any of your official documents, your official transcripts. It would have any, well, what's the word I'm thinking of? Anything that was a, and now my mind has gone completely blank, and so I apologize. I've already been in 3 meetings today. Anything you got in trouble for, I'll say it that way. I was looking for a better word and couldn't come up with
Reprimands, I think, is the word.
Reprimand. That is actually
counseling memos.
Counseling memos. Yes, those are the 2 words I was looking for. That as a supervisor, I should know, and didn't put in my notes. So those would be in your file. Typically, those have a date that they expire and that they should be removed from your personnel file. And so it's very important that as you start on these processes that you ask to see your personnel file. You have the right to review it. You have the right to go in, and you should be looking for those things and to make sure that they are removed when they're supposed to be removed. Who has access to your personnel file? Your supervisor has access to your personnel file at times. Your HR office obviously does. Your review committee has access to your personnel file under circumstances, depending on your campus policies. Here at Delhi, our continuing and term appointment committee has access to our personnel file. And that should all be laid out in your guidelines for your campus. So you should make sure that you're paying attention to that. So it is very important that you do review your personnel file. And how can it be used? It's a part of your portfolio. It's a part of your packet. So they can look at that and they can see your educational experience. They can double check and make sure that you're being truthful about what you've accomplished. They can look and see if there have been consistent issues. You know, are you an employee in good standing? Do you have the skills, the subset that you've said that you have? So all of that can go toward the committee recommending or not recommending. So that can be used. Your portfolio is kind of the big piece that I think many of us think about when we think about our continuing appointment or our promotion. It's that big piece of it that everybody worries about and everybody thinks about. So who's going to see it? Typically, it's going to be whatever committees you have on campus, and that varies campus to campus. And it could be a committee within your unit, your library, and then a campus-wide committee. And you have to think about your audience. Is it going to be people who understand what the library is and what your job roles are? Are these people from outside the library who don't have a close relationship? And somehow I backed up. Who don't have a close relationship, who don't understand the library? Do you need to be more intentional about what you place in there, what you talk about? So really think about who your audience is and what you want to say with the documents that you're including in there. Other documentation that you're going to include are going to be things such as student evaluations, if you're doing instruction, or for programs that you've put on. colleague statements and letters, supervisory reviews. A little bit farther on, we give a whole list of other types of documents that you may include in your portfolios. And this is going to be very, very individual for many people, depending on your role on campus, your role in the library and what you do. It does change. And there's a lot of ideas. As we were working on this presentation, there were multiple things. I was like, I never thought to include that in mine. Like, it opened my eyes again. And I've been working, with this committee for a couple of years, and there were great ideas that I hadn't thought of. So I was making a list because I'm in the process of updating my portfolio again. So it was great. There's lots of things to think about, and that's why groups like this really are so helpful. And as Dan said, talking to other librarians, asking the questions, because it really will help you in the process. So knowing what's required on your campus is a big piece of this. When you look at your campus guidelines, look at what documentation is absolutely required. Is there a form that you have to fill out that you have to list certain things on? Do you have to include an updated CV? What's your narrative that you have to include? What has to be in it? What specifics? All of that's really important. There's in the chat, Carrie Martin from Purchase says, absolutely, considering your audience, review committees typically include non-librarians. Many of our libraries are small and we don't have a lot of librarians, which is part of why we started the committee and have started offering these sessions. And because we know that there's not a lot of support for our library colleagues on their campuses. And as Dan said, we have to inform them of what librarians do, often repeatedly. I include my library job description in my portfolio because I know that most people don't know what I do. And so it's one of the first things that's in my portfolio. Does anyone have any questions about kind of the types of documentation that we include? And I see in the chat, we're talking about library jargon not being helpful. We actually have that a little bit later. We make that point as well. You can use the acronyms, but make sure you explain them that first time. Expand on them, discuss them.
One of the things I had was explaining why that matters. It's like, oh, this is a SACO proposal that was reviewed by the Library of Congress. Matters a little bit more to people. Even the math department knows about the Library of Congress.
If I stop doing this, all the databases will stop working, or interlibrary loan will stop working is also a good one.
Why did I never include that?
Put it more positively, but make sure people understand that there's an impact there, especially if you're very much behind the scenes.
Yeah, absolutely. How can you put what you're doing on campus and how it affects campus as a whole? I think that's something that we forget, and we're so used to doing the work and just doing it, and we forget about how to sometimes put ourselves out there and talk about why what we do matters to everybody else so much. So Scott, does SUNYLA have a collection of all of the library policies and guidelines? We are talking about working on that. That is something that comes up repeatedly year after year. And so our committee has talked about how can we make that happen and put together some sort of repository and collect those. Several campuses have been working on revising them. Some of us have a few policies from a few campuses, and we're happy to try to help you with that. Impact of work is a key for UB dossiers outside the library too. That's great. Yep, it comes up on the list-serv a lot. Yeah, even among librarians, we might not always have a good sense of what particular responsibilities entail. Technical services versus instruction, absolutely.
We'll be talking about this more as we go along as well.
Yep. So we'll just kind of move along, and if you have other thoughts or questions, please continue to put them in the chat, and we'll touch base on them. These are great points. So documenting what you do as we move along. So what do you already have? What are you doing and how are you keeping track of it? This is, something that I struggle with. I have great intentions and I'm like, I'm going to start a Google Doc and I'm going to just put all my things in there. I'm going to update my CV as the year goes on, and I forget about it. We started this session and putting it together, and I looked at my portfolio and was like, oh, I'm actually need to turn in my portfolio this year for continuing appointment. And I haven't updated it since I got my last promotion a couple of years ago. So, I started frantically trying to update it for the session so that I could have it slightly updated. And in the process, was like, wow, I have a couple of years worth of things that I need to work on here. So what are you doing and how do you keep track of it? It's really important that you find a system that works. Ask to see others' portfolios whenever possible to glean ideas. It's, like I said, working on this with April and Dan, they gave me so many ideas that I was writing notes down and things that are in this session. I'm like, oh, I have these things. I need to put these into my portfolio because I think they're going to be really helpful. A lot of times we don't think about what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. The things that we're really good at or that we're working on. So scholarship. This kind of takes care of itself, I think, a lot of times. We're doing these things, but it's tracking it. It's making sure that you're including it. Attending conferences, presenting at conferences, presenting a poster. If you're writing book reviews, if you are, writing an article, if you're co-writing, all of those things are your scholarship. That gets included. Make sure that you're tracking it. Make sure that you're including that on your CV, that you're including that in your portfolio. And we give you some ideas on how to include that. Your lesson plans, your instructional documents, your evaluations of your classes, all of those. If your department doesn't have evaluations to be used, create your own. Absolutely include those. If you don't have an evaluation, if you don't have a formal evaluation of colleagues coming in to do a peer evaluation of your teaching. Create your own, ask one of us. Many of our campuses do, and we're happy to share those so that you have that to be included in your portfolio. Reference chat transcripts, you can pull those, just remove the personal data from it. That's a great way to illustrate what we do when you're on the reference chat. Your annual reports, which include your goals, how you've accomplished things for the year, listing out and discussing the budgets that you administer and how you do that. Conference programs, they're huge. So you can use Adobe, you can chop down the files just to show the title page and your presentation listed in the conference program. There's lots of ways that you can do that so that you don't have to include the full presentation or the full program. So many things that you can do. There's a lot going on in the chat right now. I see it moving. So we'll take a look at that in a minute. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So more of what you already have. Proof of membership, service and contribution to external groups. We spoke a little bit about ACRL, SUNYLA, ALA, NYLA, Eastern New York ACRL, or any of the other smaller branches of ACRL, any of those organizations that you're involved in, your certificate of membership, a notice that you're involved in a committee within them, any of those things that you can show, that you can include, an email that says like, hey, thank you again for volunteering as, this. You can print that off, you can include that, you can take a screenshot, a Snagit, whatever you have of that, and include that in your documentation. Thank you notes, acknowledgements from on and off campus. This is something that I honestly never thought to include until we were doing this. I think that's a great thing. It's a recognition from others of something that you did and you provided a service. They're thanking you for what you've done, your skill and professional reputation. Email exchanges. Again, I never thought of this with people's names redacted, obviously. Showing your participation in and contribution to committee discussions, online collaborations. You can check first with them, with others, make sure that it's okay to include this type of information. And photographs. Especially if you're doing something digitally, this is great. You can do it on paper, you can print them out and include it in a paper portfolio as well. But photos of new service areas, displays, events, photographs are great. Pictures, I think, provide such a really vibrant part to your portfolio. And they really can showcase something that you've done. So again, it's a great way. A lot of discussion in the chat, which is great. April, you want to jump in on tech?
Yes, indeedy. Since I'm the only tech services librarian in our little group, at least the three of us, and it's something that comes up a lot, is how do you do, how do you adapt teaching and librarianship and display for tech services? I mean, even other librarians don't understand what we do. So here are some examples of, this isn't exhaustive by any means, but you can, if you're doing SACO and NACO proposals to the Library of Congress, yes, you should include that. Are you generating these big giant cleanup reports from Alma? Sure, include a sample, not the whole thing. Any kind of statistics you keep for your department, budget reports, if you are administering the electronic resources, showing the counter reports and saying, you know, our students are using these and I administer them, and if I don't administer them, our students can't do their work. Things like that. This one I think is important, emails to other areas regarding impact on their work. For example, a few years ago when the Library of Congress changed the term cookery to cooking, and it's like, yeah, everybody who works reference, don't use cookery anymore. Emailing the culinary department and saying, if you're looking for stuff, the term is now cooking. This is analogous to when they finally moved from Afro-Americans to African-Americans when they acknowledged that Vietnam was a war, things like that. And that does impact people because you don't want anybody going, oh, yeah, well, nobody told me about that. And Carrie, could you, do I have another page on that one, or is that just the next one? Nope, that's it for me. Carrie, back to you.
Okay, all right. So, you know, more documentation, ask for letters, and I saw that in the chat as well. You know, ask for letters from your colleagues. If you're involved in SUNYLA, in any other organization, ask the people that you work with, that you've worked on a presentation, a program, an initiative with, if they would be willing to write you a letter. You know, committee chairs, things like that, administration, faculty you've worked with, supervisors. And again, you have to be careful, particularly with supervisors, you know, what's appropriate for your portfolio, what's not. But a lot of that is very much good to include in your portfolio. If you're taking on new duties or a new project, and Dan covered this, you know, how is this documented for my portfolio? How can you include this? How can you make sure that it's representative of what you're doing and how it applies to your position? I see Karen talks about, we have a philosophy of librarianship section. Teaching is part of that, but it includes the rest of the librarianship too, not limited to just the teaching part of what we do. And SUNY Delhi, a couple of years ago, redid our promotion and tenure guidelines, and we included, there's now an excellence in teaching section and an excellence in librarianship section. So, and they clearly state that librarians will be evaluated on the librarianship section. So there is teaching included in it, but it's very specific to librarianship, which was a huge win for us. It makes it much easier to demonstrate some of the things that we do. But it took several years. So, you know, it's important to know what your guidelines are on your campus and be aware of those. So there was a lot in the chat. There was some questions about electronic portfolios, knowing what your campus requires, how your documentation has to be turned in. We're going to talk a little bit about organizing your portfolio, and that's really kind of part of that. Dan?
Yeah, a couple of questions from the chat. I'm not going to read them out because the chat has been moving so quickly, but I wanted to address them. Renee asked about blog posts for a professional organization. I think that very much depends on the content of the blog post, whether, is it more scholarly, is it, or is it, a sort of a newsletter to the members or something like that. So that would factor into it. Your campus policies would factor into it. Ideally, what you'll be able to do is find that it fits into multiple areas. And so if you're feeling like one area is stronger than the other, you can kind of move it to one or the other. But these are the sort of questions you want to ask as you go forward with that. We had a question about where to find philosophy of teaching. I'd say probably the SUNYLA list-serv is always a great resource. Just tell everybody, hey, I need policies, or I want to see examples of people's philosophy of teaching, and they'll send them to you. I would like to say that I think you should get librarian ones and also ones from outside the library. So if the other faculty are using a particular format or a particular structure for it, then you know it, and then what you present can look something like theirs, so that your higher level people can see what exactly it is. Can say, oh yeah, I know what this is supposed to look like, and that'll help you along.
Yep. Great discussion. I love the sharing. So organizing your portfolio. We'll just kind of move along there. So look at what other people have done. What do people outside the library expect? What does your campus require? Again, that's really important. And I saw in here that some campuses require everything to be done by PDF and uploaded into their campus system. Some campuses are okay with things being done on paper still, or require it to be in a binder. Our campus requires certain things to be uploaded into Interview Exchange, and there's a limit on how many pages and how large the files are. But they're also okay if I turn in a link to a LibGuide, which is what I've done for the last little bit, as has every librarian on our campus. And so I'll actually share that in a minute and show what we've done. So all of our addenda are on a LibGuide versus having to try to create it down. So we're just turning in a link, and they seem to really like that. So online versus paper, what's better? Well, again, it might depend. Do you need links? Did you write a book? Dan has a note here. Do you want to talk about the impact of COVID-19 at Cortland and your process?
Okay, I found the mute button. This was just something that came up. I don't know what your situations were at your campuses, but Cortland is a very print-heavy campus. Except for the librarians, we're really, everyone's just gone online and gone electronic. So what happened this semester was that the shutdown came in the middle of the portfolio process, and so we had this situation where managers just had to go in and basically scan in thick folders of stuff in order to be able to complete that process. And of course there were delays and things like that. So I'm wondering, this may be something that's worth keeping an eye on our campus and on your other campuses where they've typically used paper portfolios, to see if maybe they've decided that this isn't worth it anymore. But we'll see what happens as it develops.
Yeah, so absolutely. I think we could see some changes to that, as Dan said, because everything hit at this time of year when all of this is going on. Keep an eye on that. So what are the key areas of your portfolio? Well, again, look at your guidelines. What does your campus want you to include? But in general, the areas that Dan spoke about at the beginning of the presentation, your mastery of your subject area, your scholarship, your service, your teaching, your librarian stuff. Those are the areas that the SUNY Board of Trustees has laid out, while allowing for other areas to be included. So that tends to be what campuses follow, are those 5 areas with some leeway. What goes in each area? Well, anything that you can think of that's going to support your case that you are doing what you're supposed to be doing, that you are going above and beyond the minimum requirements of your job, that you are contributing to the field. I think that's really what you're trying to show. Electronic links do make it easier to put something in multiple sections. You can put a link in and it's going to pop up where you want it to. It's good that if you're doing that, that you're noting that it links out into other areas. It's important that your portfolio resembles other portfolios on campus, that yours is not completely different, because you don't want to confuse the reviewers. You don't want to frustrate them when they're looking at a portfolio that has nothing in common with other portfolios. Oftentimes they're going through a lot of them. They're going through a lot of documents. They're going through a lot of information. They want it to be somewhat similar, just like when you're looking at resumes for a search committee, and suddenly you have one that you can't find the information where you expect it to be. They want it to be similar. Scholarship, service teaching, those things need to be represented. It's important to think about how can you relate the things that we do in librarianship to some of the things that happen with a faculty who's a teaching faculty or a research faculty member on your campus. We do things differently. That's how it is, but how can we relate it? How can we explain it in a way that is going to make sense to people who aren't in the field, and make them understand, like, this relates back to what I do. So, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. I get it. I understand why they do it that way, or that makes sense. I get it. And that's kind of like how we do things. So, okay, that moves along. So it's kind of, I don't want to say librarianship for dummies, but in a way it kind of is when you're doing this. So I'm going to take a minute. I'm just going to pop up we'll see if I just click over, if it shows. Did it click over to the other tab? Okay, perfect. So this is, again, a slightly updated LibGuide that was the supporting materials for my promotion from assistant to senior assistant librarian a few years ago. And all I did was take the addendum material that I needed to include. At the front, I had basically a table of contents with the links that gave an example, so they could link to each of the tabs. And then when you click on each tab, it gives some of the materials. So effectiveness of librarianship and teaching. Again, I have my job description because it can be confusing for people to understand what my job is on campus. So it's right there. There was a question about teaching finding aids. Well, here's research guides, links directly to them that I've created. Some of the teaching tools that I had created for some of the instruction sessions I've done. Pictures of some of the programs that I've coordinated for the library. And then some of the materials that I created. So it's bright and it's visible, and they can scroll down and click on links. And it just gives something for them to look at, and it's a little bit different. Scholarly ability is something fairly similar. It has a link to the book that has a chapter that I co-authored. It has a book review. It does have a blog, because a blog that I wrote for ALA's programming librarian section was included as scholarly, so it's linked there. Some of the programs and posters that I presented are right there. And then again, just things that are there. Actually, a Prezi was linked in. So trying to show things that I've done and had presented and been a part of in a way that was a little bit different than just printing it out and putting it in a paper file, or having a screenshot of it and including it in a PDF that was linked into Interview Exchange. And the campus seemed to take well to it. So as of this year, all of the librarians at Delhi have adopted this format and are using it. And the campus has been very receptive to it. And we actually have some faculty who asked us about how they can do something similar. So it's worked well for us. Although we're not giving them LibGuides. We'll do something different and help them with a website or something. Let's see. Move on to the next slide. Any questions about portfolios and organizing your portfolio? I haven't looked at the chat.
The chat has some good comments in it, but I don't know if there's anything that quite rises to a question. I think that their statements of librarianship did come up, but I think we're about to dive into that.
Okay, and somehow I popped in.
While you get back to that, I'd just like to point out, in case anyone missed it, Lisa, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, Zur.
Sure.
Thank you. Says we used Google Sites, but moved to Watermark, which is a portfolio system, and both links to PDFs are used along with explanatory set text. I'm like, great. Our campus has been looking for years to move to online portfolios, and now it's like, hey, here's one I can recommend now. Thank you.
Yeah, I did see Brady asked how well does the LibGuide format if I were to go to work for another library. If the other library had a subscription to LibGuides, I could probably transfer it over. But if not, I would need to try to print screens of everything and pull the links and everything off. It wouldn't travel well otherwise. So
I think you can expect if you move to another library, you will probably have to do whatever system they have, whether that's online, and that can be part of your decision that you make when you're transferring between libraries.
Yeah, and yes, you can save the chat if you click on the 3 button, the little 3 ellipses, and hover over it. It says more. If you click on that, there's a save chat, so it'll save it from whatever point you click save chat, and it'll save to your computer into a Zoom folder.
I do believe it's part of the recording.
It will be as well, yes.
Yes. We've had a couple notes in the chat about CVs and sample CVs, and I think also looking at other people's binders. I know all the people in the library have looked at mine, people outside the library have looked at mine. It's like, if anybody wants to come to Cobleskill and look at mine because it's still paper, happy to let you into the building.
Yeah, and I've shared my link out to mine with people. I'm happy, again, I'm in the process of updating it now. So a lot of it's old and I'm trying to get new content on there, but I'm happy to share it. Yep. So we'll move on to the narrative section. So writing your narrative, I kind of joked about the librarianship for dummies, but it is a little bit, who will see it and what are they expecting? We've talked about the fact that many of your review committee will not be librarians. Some campuses do have an in-house review committee that looks through your portfolio first. So they may have a better understanding of your position, although the point was also made that we don't always know everything about all of our colleagues. But assume an audience outside the library knows nothing about the library. I think that's just a good standard to think about. Avoid jargon. Think about using a narrative that's long enough to explain but short enough to be readable. Oftentimes you have a page limit, a word limit, something that you have to stay within, and you want to be able to cover everything that you feel you need to cover without being overly wordy. You want to be concise, I think. Evaluators are looking at many portfolios most of the time. So you want to be able to keep their attention. You don't want them to wander away. Cover the gaps. You want to be able to talk about things that perhaps your portfolio doesn't show. Topics with less documentation, things that you can't really show in an example. It's hard to show supervision with a picture. So being able to talk about that, discuss a little bit about what you do, how you contribute in that way. Things that you might need to explain a little bit more are the things that you want to include in your narrative. It's not necessarily a rundown of everything that you do. Avoid the use of jargon, as we talked about, but it's a great place where you can explain some of those acronyms. You can give a little bit of background. You can talk about how ACRL is, the preeminent college and research library organization in the nation. and that you are involved in it. And then you can have your examples and you can use the acronym because you've given some explanation to it. Sell your significance to the library and the campus. How do you contribute? How are you contributing to the field? I liken it to, this is your elevator speech about yourself. You know, you're selling yourself. So, you know, this is your chance to shine. And I know that's hard for a lot of us to do, you know, but it's really, really important to do it. If your contribution to a group project isn't clear, if it doesn't, you know, come across really well in your examples, again, this is where you get to explain that or show that or tell that, and use this narrative as that point for it. I think the next slide might be yours, April. Yep.
It is. Okay, so we're going to talk about tech services again, because again, this is something that doesn't always fit as easily. If you're an instruction librarian, it's really easy to talk about how you teach and your philosophy of teaching and how many students you taught and and on and on. But basically, when you're talking about the tech services aspects of librarianship, you kind of have to ask yourself, well, how does what I do fit those goals? So how does managing ALMA or our ILS contribute to the educational effort at this institution? What kind of classes do I need to take to stay up to date on this? Do we do assessments in our area of like our operations, and why? And why does that fabulous, and how does it demonstrate that you should totally promote me? For me, I also do reference, and I really do think that cataloging strengthens my performance at the reference desk because I understand how information is organized, and I am all up to date on the latest subject headings as well. So those continue. I think we have one more.
Yep.
Carrie, if you can hit. All right, so here are some other examples, and of course this is not exhaustive. We could spend an entire day talking about all this stuff. One of the things they talk about in regular portfolios, for lack of a better term, is advisement of students and student interactions and stuff. If you work in the back all the time, you may not have a lot of that. But if you have student employees and you supervise them or interact with them or train them or use them to do work in some way, talk about what your role is and how that contributes to the student's education and their development. How does you doing a fabulous job of pinching every penny in that acquisitions budget help to contribute to the bottom line of the college? Because financial management, if you will, is always important to the college. How do you approach collection development? Do you work with faculty outside the library? This one I had to sell so many times, not necessarily in my portfolio, but to the campus in general, is why it's important to weed. If I was Harvard, maybe I wouldn't be weeding, but in my little library, yes, you definitely need to weed. And you know, sometimes you're still doing stuff that's public facing, not just the catalog system or the databases, but perhaps a display that's from the archives or that you've helped the public services area do, whatever it is. How does that help to create a productive educational environment? I've often seen in our displays that makes people stop and look and think, and that's very important when you're talking about engagement. And that, I think, is the end of that. Do we have any questions now?
There's one in the chat, April, speaking about how do you explain that fixing an e-resource issue might take a few days? And it's hard to
I guess
quantify.
by saying it takes a few days, especially if it's something that you can't fix yourself. If it's something that you have, like somebody was talking about a mechanic later on, it's like, well, if I have to take this into the mechanic, I have to get an appointment, wait for them to get the part from another state, you know, all these different things. And if you can document that sometimes, like with excerpted email transcripts back and forth between you and tech services at Elsevier, then great. Otherwise, how to explain that it takes days, I don't know. But how to explain what happens when it doesn't work? Because we all know they don't notice some of our work because it just works. you know, everything's seamless and everything works, but when it doesn't work, they let you know about it.
Yep, I think that's great. And several other people mentioned, you know, that it's very important to instead talk about the discovery and access for researchers and why that's the importance of what you're doing.
Yep. And I'm seeing some things about there, quantifying your impact.
Mm-hmm.
Things we track here in my area is turnaround time. How long does it take new items to go from receipt to shelf? And we have a target range in there. Right now it's summer and a pandemic, so of course that's completely out the window, but it's something we do document and can keep track of. And how many times, I guess this one's harder. It's like that idea of you can't prove a negative. It's like, well, if I'm not fixing problems that people find in the catalog, how can I prove that I fixed problems in the catalog? Maybe because there are no problems in the catalog. So if I said I haven't had to fix any problems in the catalog in 3 years, that's a good thing. I don't even know if I get that. Let's see if there's anything else. Quantifying troubleshooting, working with a third party, interfacing with technical experts, of course, who speak a completely different language, sometimes literally. These are some good comments. It's great. How many hours per week or month do you have to spend troubleshooting? Very important. Okay, I'm going to be sharing my screen now, so hang on a second. Is it showing up okay?
Yep, you're good.
Excellent. Okay, so now we're going to talk about getting promoted. Let's say you've gotten tenure, or you're at the lowest rank possible and you want to move up. You need to get promoted. And let me see if there we go. I want to make sure I'm on the right window when I do this. Okay, so how is going for promotion different than going for reappointment or tenure? In many ways, it's not. Other than it largely being optional, the only things are the timing and its impact on you. And sometimes you have to do some extra paperwork. Like at my campus, you have to do an application to establish that you're eligible for consideration. Doesn't mean you're going to get it, but it means we'll at least look at your portfolio. And sometimes you can also, I've never done this, but some people I've heard do use job ads to help make the case that all the other librarians are being hired at this rank. And you've got me down here, so maybe you should move me up a little bit. I'm not sure about that one. But the rules that apply to it. In SUNY, for example, the Board of Trustees rules still apply. Your local campus rules still apply. Any of those unwritten norms still apply. I mean, you can go up for promotion at any time, at any rank. But a lot of campuses, not all, but a lot of campuses expect you to go for the promotion to associate professor or associate librarian, which I have a note on that in a second, at the same time that you go for continuing appointment. So you have to keep in mind when you do that, that you're not only trying to hit the mark for the continuing appointment, and you're currently at this rank, you're trying to hit the mark for the rank above. So you have to meet or beat that mark, whatever it is. The note I wanted to make is SUNY is weird. And I think we've all figured that out pretty quickly. We have special ranks for the librarians. We are academic personnel, same as the math professors, but we have special ranks that we can use. It's not required to use them, oddly enough. Our campuses can choose to use regular professorial ranks, but in SUNY, you have at the lowest rank of the regular faculty is lecturer. The equivalent of that is assistant librarian. And then you go up to assistant professor, and now you're confused because you've already used the word assistant. So we have senior assistant librarian. Then we go, everything after that is regular. Associate professor, associate librarian, professor, librarian. And then in SUNY, we even have a rank above that of distinguished professor or librarian. So when you're talking in SUNY, it's something to keep in mind. Although I do believe all or the vast majority of the community colleges in SUNY use the regular professorial titles and avoid the confusion altogether. So let me see if I have anything else I wanted to make sure to talk about there. Not really. Oh, other than there was one thing. We've talked about those unwritten norms earlier when Dan was talking. And those can come into play because while it's technically allowable for you to go for tenure at a lower rank than associate, and it's technically allowable for you to go for a promotion to associate or whatever before tenure, sometimes people will go, what are you doing? That's not how it's done here. And you might want to be aware of the past history or any cultural norms on your campus, especially if some of the people who hold tight to those cultural norms might be on your review committee. It can happen. It shouldn't happen. We've been at my campus, which we redid our rules a few years ago. And one of the things we've stressed is you judge on the evidence before you, not what you heard the other day when you were going to a session on something. No, you have to judge on the evidence because otherwise you're going to be judging on gossip, and that's not fair to anybody. So do we have any questions at this point? Now that I'm sharing, I can't see the chat.
The chat is up to date, April.
Excellent.
I have some comments to make here,
Okay.
to reinforce some of these points. Things to know, first of all, the SUNY Board of Trustees policies, when they give the how promotions should be judged, it's a cut and paste of the material in the evaluation section. So basically there's no difference according to that. Local campus practices can vary and it's good to know them. For example, there was a while there where Cortland required a second degree in order to go up for promotion, and that was quite problematic. And we got rid of that about almost a decade. Well, actually more like 5 years ago, so that people would have more opportunities. It came from an era where it was a lot easier to get a very cheap education and be able to get that second degree. I'd say with regard to that sort of change in the title bit that April mentioned about the question, some libraries here are hiring at assistant librarian and some are hiring at senior assistant librarian. If you were hired the assistant librarian, I would say go out and look some job ads. The SUNYLA list-serv once again is good for that. See if anybody in a similar title was hired at senior assistant and think about making that case as soon as possible. So that you can get that little bit of a salary bump and you're going to be more on par with your colleagues. There is one other little weird thing, wrinkle that I want to point out about this process. If you are promoted to associate.
My next point, yep.
Yep. Oh, you want to go ahead and do that?
You go right ahead.
Okay, so the weird thing is if you are promoted to associate, before you get to continuing appointment at SUNY, you start a clock. And that's a 3-year clock to go up for continuing appointment. That means it is possible to do this. Be hired as a senior assistant librarian 1 year. Next year, go up for promotion to associate. And the year after that, go for continuing appointment. Of course, if you do this too close to the end of the process, it doesn't really matter because you can't go farther than that sixth year anyway. It is an option that's open to people, and it's something that's there in the Board of Trustees policies, Karen. I can probably find chapter and verse for people if they want that. It's something that is it rarely happens. I would really talk with everybody on your campus before you do it. I think we brought it up to our administration from a union perspective. We were asking, hey guys, what about these early continuing appointments? They said that we don't know anything about that. And then we said, well, what about the people who are getting promoted and then go through this and this? Oh yeah, we know about that. We do have people who do that. It is an option. It is something I would definitely have a lot of conversations about before I would try attempt it, but it's out there.
Yeah, one of the things I had in my notes was be aware of your personal tenure timeline. Did you get any credit for prior service when you came in? What is your timeline? You could theoretically say, okay, I'm going to put it here, and then it won't shorten my clock at all, but I'll get the more money now, which is a possibility. It also depends what other criteria your campus has. Do you have to have a certain number of years in service years in that title? That came up this year with someone in another area going up for full professor before they had the number of years an associate professor. And someone signed off on it, and so it went forward, and then nobody wanted to say no to it because it would embarrass the person who signed off on it. And yet they're so angry about this person basically breaking the rules and getting promoted when she hasn't earned it. I guess some of that comes back to the unwritten norms of thou shalt not break the rules and get away with it. Are there any other questions that have come up before we move on to the next thing?
I would also add one other thing that I probably should say about continuing appointment at SUNY. It is an up or out process. You go up once, and then if it doesn't work, then you cannot go up again. I think there are other systems where that may be different, and that's always a good question to ask about.
Yes, I mean here, if you don't get that tenure, you're fired. You have notice, a full notice. By the time you've gotten to that, you have to give you a year's notice, but still. Whereas if you don't get the promotion, you just try again.
I've seen at least one community college where you could go up for continuing appointment multiple times, but so good.
That would take some of the pressure off, I think.
Yeah, it would.
I remember once we had a staff meeting with the support staff and everybody, and some of them were complaining about how often the librarians were out of the building, going to meetings and doing this and going to conferences. And it's like, well, if I don't do that, I'm going to get fired. If I don't get tenure, I lose my job. So I'm going to be out of the building doing these things. And some of these were long-term employees who had been with the college for a lot of years. And, oh, I had no idea. We just thought you didn't like being here, or that you thought you were too good for us. And it's like, really? So asking, telling things, getting things out in the open, there's an illustration of how that really matters.
So Carol Ann just made the point that you can appeal your tenure if you're denied tenure.
Yes.
It can be appealed. And I just made the note in the chat too that just everyone needs to be aware of the Board of Trustees tenure clock stop that came through and how that's being enacted on your campus.
Yep.
Our campus was a complete stop unless you say you don't want it. So
I think that's
I think that's how
UUP,
it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, done.
Yeah, it
but
should
I
be
know,
across the campuses.
Yeah, so just make sure that you're aware of that and how you want to move that. And I mean, I think for most people, it's not worth that unless you have personal reasons that it would be helpful. But for most people, I think
it is an opt-out.
Yeah, you have to opt out of it. Otherwise, you have an extra year automatically.
So I guess you decided not to opt out, Carrie.
I decided not to opt out. Or
You did opt out.
I am opting out. I want my process to move forward as it was originally scheduled. Yes.
Cool.
No reason.
Note before I forget, when we talked a little bit about prior service credit and how it can get you hired at a higher rank, or it can get you on your tenure clock. I will give you a real world example. When I got hired, it was at the senior assistant or assistant professor level, whereas they wanted to hire me at a lower level, but they applied my years of service toward my rank rather than my tenure clock. And a colleague who was hired a year or so later, maybe 2 years, did it the other way, and had to hit the ground running because they had a much shorter clock and hadn't been in a tenure track position before and was really kind of floundering. So it giveth and it taketh, definitely. So if do we have any more things before we move on to the next section?
No, I think you're up to date and we have about 14 minutes left.
Okay, I can talk faster. Sticking points. There are certain things that people always seem to get stuck on. One of them is research. What is scholarship or scholarly activity versus research? For example, if you look at Boyer, he says that anything you do is in an educational realm is scholarship of practice, I believe he called it. So did you make a LibGuide for a class? That's scholarly activity. Did you make handouts? Did you do displays? Well, maybe not displays, but a lot of this is still scholarly activity. But what counts at your library on your campus can vary considerably. I know there are some libraries, some campuses in SUNY where they expect a set number of peer-reviewed publications before you even go up for tenure. And if you don't get them, you don't get it. And that's the end of it. And then there's ones like mine that are very teaching focused, which means they're very librarianship focused. If I never published anything, it would be okay with them, as long as I was doing something else in terms of scholarship. Research, of course, and scholarship can be different because research implies that you have a form of formal inquiry. You have a question, you have a problem that you're working on. So there are, of course, differences, but your mileage may vary, I guess, is the way to sum it up. One thing I did want to make sure to point out is some campuses are adamant that your research or publication, regardless of whether it's peer-reviewed or not, be library focused. And others, as long as you're doing it, they don't much care. Especially if you're the liaison to the English department and you're doing research and publishing in that field, that can be really good, especially because it gives you more traction when you're talking to the faculty in that area and trying to get them to cooperate with you. I know some people who have run into that in the past. So you don't know where to start. It's like, that was one of the things with me. It's like, where do I start with this? There's so many things I want to do, and I've never done anything at that level, and what am I going to do? For me, one of the most useful things was to copy something that's already been done in a way. Not publish it, not present on it, but just do it for the practice of it. Recreate a study that was already done. Try to adapt something that was already done to your situation and write it up as if you were going to publish it, and just get that work in. And we're going to talk about doing collaborations with other librarians in a moment. So that's something we'll get to as well. Time is something we stick on a lot when it comes to doing our research and our scholarship. We're very busy. Our days, people are always adding things on to us. Do try to set aside a little bit of time to work on that and protect that time fiercely as much as you can. It's okay to work on it a little bit at a time. It's okay to maybe put it off for a while, you know, and work on it. Say, okay, next month or next week or whatever, I'm going to take these 2 days and I'm just going to power through this. It depends on your working style and what works for your library. And then another thing that sometimes gets in the way with research is, how am I going to pay for this? I need to go to this conference. I need to take this class. Of course, your campus and your library and other places will have some professional development money now, maybe not as much with the results of the pandemic. SUNYLA has a professional development grant program available for its members. So look into it. And also sometimes your union will have tuition reimbursements as a possibility. UUP has individual development awards, and then other financial support as well. See, I'm not going to stop at this point because I want to get to the next slide and then we'll stop again. Mentors, collaborators, and external reviewers. Sometimes, you know, a lot of librarians are introverts and don't like to talk to other people or ask for help or whatever. But you got to do it sometimes. So one way to really help with that is mentorship. If your campus has, or your library has a mentorship program, take advantage of it. Even if whoever they match you up with has nothing to do with what you do, because they're being tagged as a mentor on purpose because they know stuff about the campus. ACRL, ALCTS, they have mentorship programs. I've served as a mentor for them, so I am aware of those. Look into them. They can be quite helpful. Sometimes they're a little bit more structured. You can, of course, look for the people you've met in conference sessions like this and make those connections. It comes down to networking in some cases. And there's formal mentorship and informal mentorship. When we hire a new librarian, you know, you sit down with them and you say, okay, here's some things you need to know. Bing, bing, bing. That's informal mentorship. Them asking you questions, them looking at your binder, or asking you to look through their binder before they submit it. That's informal mentorship, and it's valuable. Collaborators, which we touched on very briefly as a possibility in the research section. You don't have to do it all on your own. You just want to bring whatever expertise you have to the table. Don't go to somebody and say, well, I don't know nothing about what you're doing, but I want to work with you. What do you know? And then you can even volunteer yourself and say, look, this first time out, you don't even have to give me credit. I don't have to be a named author, but I can crunch numbers for you. I'm a fantastic editor. I can do some literature review for you just to get my feet wet, and that will open some doors for you. My very first presentation in SUNYLA was a collaboration with a person I had never met. She saw a post I did on the list-serv about the topic she was presenting on and said, hey, how would you like to work with me on this? And there you go, I'm doing a SUNYLA presentation on plagiarism. But external reviewers, it's the same kind of thing. Some places require external review, some don't. If it does require external review, it's going to be on them to lay out the rules of how it's going to work on what kind of material you have to give them, what they need to give you, and they'll lay out the rules on who identifies the reviewer. I've had some cases where someone contacts me and says, hey, are you willing to be one of my reviewers? Great, someone will be in touch. I've had other cases where their boss contacts me and says, you've been identified as a possible reviewer for this person. And they would prefer, in that case, that you don't know them very well. You know, they want you to be completely unbiased as possible. And if you do know them, they'll disqualify you, like if you guys are friends. So those things will be taken care of if it's required. If it's not, then it's going to be on you. And it can vary as to why you would do it. Sometimes you want to do it in an informal way just to say, hey, I've only got 2 librarians here and I need somebody to look at this. I'm too close to it. It's too important to me. I need another person to look at it. Okay, great. Make it easy for them. Put it all online or send it to them with a return envelope inside so they can send it back, whatever it takes. And sometimes having that external reviewer can add weight, especially if you're a little bit nervous or, well, we're all nervous about it, but getting Carol Ann Germain from the University at Albany to say that you're fabulous and should be promoted or given tenure really does help add weight. And I know we're running out of time. So this is just a quick moment of peace and beauty. We all need our moment of peace and beauty. This is the coast of Maine, because there's always uncertainty and there's always tension. Know that you're not alone in this. We're all going through it, and there are ways to reach out. There are the list-servs, there's people to talk to. You need to vent, call me and vent. People vent to me all the time. Why not you? It's very important to start stress management now. It doesn't have to be alcoholic, but if you choose to, this is one option.
Be very careful with that recipe.
It can be deadly. It really can. Careful what you mix with it as well.
Sneaks up on you.
Yeah, that was in the swag gift basket or whatever we got for the early registrants. But you're going to be scared. You're going to be nervous. You need to say, okay, yeah, I am. And don't let it paralyze you. Don't let it sabotage you. It's like, okay, it is, and I'm going to get help, and I'm going to take a moment for peace and beauty, whatever it is to get you through. And remember, you really are not alone. You can reach out to me and Carrie and Dan. You can post to the SUNYLA list with questions and make contacts that way. It's an open list. You don't have to be a SUNYLA member. Some of our people who have chimed in today or answered questions on the chat are willing to look at your portfolios for you or speak with you one-on-one and be that informal mentor, or formal for that matter in some cases. And they're all valuable people. I think all but one of these people personally and can recommend them without reservation. So that's it. Do we have any other questions in the 4 minutes or whatever that we have left?
The next session doesn't start until 3, so if we go a little over with questions or discussion, that's fine if anyone wants to hang out. But we wanted to wrap up on time or as close to time as we could to give you all a little break if needed.
Yep. I stopped the share, so now we have a Brady Bunch view on my screen.
One thing I did want to highlight while people are thinking about if they want to ask something is the Drescher Awards. These are for UUP represented campuses. This is effectively, if someone is tenure track, they've been in the SUNY system for a while and they're having some trouble, finding that time for scholarship. If they are part of a disadvantaged group, that could be based on race, that could be based on age, that could be based on status as a veteran, and it can be based on gender, which is especially important given the gender breakdown of librarians. They can have a semester through the Drescher Leave program to simply sit down and work on their scholarship. So basically, it's like a sabbatical before continuing appointment. Of course, this is something you want to talk about with your union rep and the people in your library and your campus before you do, but this is something that is out there for people who find themselves having trouble just getting away from daily duties and really need to put something together before continuing appointment.
I'm going through the chat here and seeing some of the things that people were writing, and someone said something about, I hope these situations are explained to candidates before they're hired, like prior service credit. And yeah, they're usually not.
I had no idea.
Mentioned, but you can ask when they say, so do you have any questions for us? Ask. This is a good thing. And sometimes I went up for a job interview once. They sent me so much information in advance. I didn't have any questions for them because they answered them all, which was kind of depressing in a way. A rep from our APT committee meets with candidates to be sure some of the tenure issues are covered. That's a good thing to have happen. We do workshops here at Cobleskill. By the way, Catherine Brent, who's on this webinar with us, is the current chair of our campus's promotion and tenure committee. She took over after I left the committee. So librarians rule the world. But so she's doing the workshops now for people, and we encourage not just the candidates, supervisors, department chairs, deans, because it's like, I know you went through this process yourself, but it might have been a while back. Perhaps you need some updates on what the processes are, because it's amazing how many people cannot follow directions. And it comes back to bite them in the butt. So that's, I think, one of the big things we can say to everybody here is, if they give you directions, follow them.
It's very important. That can cause a lot of problems if you don't follow the directions and the guidelines you're given.
Mm-hmm. And always get somebody else to read your material before you submit it. If it's just, I've spent so much time with this, I'm too close, it's too important. You need somebody else just with an editor's eye even to check, does this all make sense? That's invaluable.
And think about whether that person is on the committee or not, because sometimes if someone's evaluating your portfolio, they really shouldn't be reading it immediately beforehand. Just keep in mind that could be a consideration.
Yeah, I tend to take the Chicago approach, vote early, vote often. I think that applies here as well.
And they're invested in you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, it looks like we've got some really good things coming up in the chat of people talking about sharing information, articles on exhibits as scholarship. And sometimes I think there's also been some questions occasionally on, does presenting at a conference count as service to that organization or as scholarship? And depending on your campus, it could go either way. And it might depend also on, am I just sitting here talking about things I already know about, or did I actually have to do some research for this? I did a presentation at the Charleston conference a couple of years on devising and using a new acquisitions formula. And that one I would definitely be counting as scholarship, because that was a lot of work.
I think it also depends on what areas do you need a boost in. Do you need more scholarship, and can you, like April said, can you apply it to that? I think that's, that has a piece in that as well.
Yes, indeed. And at least in the case of Skill, if you're looking to look at sample guidelines, ours are not hidden. They're part of our faculty handbook, and they're available on our website. No passwords necessary. That's one easy one you can get if you want to look at some samples. Is there anything else anybody wants to weigh in on? Serving on review committees yourself. Yes, and it's just like when you're on the hiring committee versus being the candidate. It totally changes your mindset. And so think about that.
Susan, that's a really good point. If your conference proposal was peer reviewed for selection, be sure to note that.
Yes, and even if your conference proposal or your book proposal or your grant proposal didn't get approved, doing it is work in and of itself and can be worthy of inclusion. Again, your mileage may vary depending on your campus. And I do know that there's a bunch of people in this session that are not SUNY librarians. I apologize for being so SUNY central, but hey, we are SUNY. It makes it hard not to. I know from what I've been, my interactions with people at non-SUNY conferences and such, that there's a lot of variety out there. Some of the things we talked about today are universal. Some of them are the special things that only apply to SUNY. So if you do have questions, please reach out. Reach out to us, reach out to the list, reach out to each other. And we're going to have as we go along on the conference, we're going to have socializing time at breakfast and lunch, virtually speaking. There's a membership social party thing tonight. And tomorrow night there's happy hour, where I think they're doing the raffle prizes and stuff. So please include that. Oh, and use the hashtag, please, SUNYLA 2020 to, if you're posting online, so that everything comes together.
Yep. All of the conference sessions are being recorded. They will be posted after the conference ends, and will be available on the SUNYLA website forever after in the archive. So that'll be something that will be available if anyone wants to come back to them. So and the slides will be available as well.
Mm-hmm. You can also go through previous years if you're of a mind to. Our previous years were in person, so there's not session recordings usually, but you can find some interesting stuff in there.
Yeah.
So.
Yep. Thank you all so much for coming. Again, if you have any specific questions, feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy. This session came about because we have a committee, promotion and tenure committee within SUNYLA. So if you're interested in helping with that or being a part of it, Dan and April and I are the committee right now. So let us know and we'd be happy to have you. And we had a session at last year's conference, and it was requested that we make it a pre-conference kind of boot camp. So that's where this came out of, and we're happy to continue to meet the needs of the membership and what people would like to see. So thank you all.
Yeah, and if you're not involved in SUNYLA, this is a great way to help build that portfolio. Leadership opportunities, committee work, networking. It's a fabulous, fun group, and our dues are super cheap. So.
And you don't have to be a SUNY librarian.
And we give out grants if you are a member. So by all means, get involved. That's all I have.
All right, I'm going to stop recording. If I can find the recording button.